It was the second week of August in 1884, and the Texas Hill Country had not seen rain in 41 days. The grass on the limestone ridges was the color of old straw. The cedars stood gray and brittle. Around midnight, in the small ranch yard, the Holloway family had built 10 miles north of the town of Crown Hollow. The wind shifted out of the west and brought with it the dry smell of cedar pollen and the long, low sound of a country waiting on weather that would not come. Margaret Holloway sat up in bed with her eyes already open. She had heard, half asleep, hoofbeats coming up the wagon track. 3 horses, maybe 4. Then the hoofbeats stopped on the far side of the barn. Then she heard the soft, heavy noise of a tin can sloshing in a man's hand. And then she smelled, sharp and wrong, the smell of pine pitch poured on dry wood. She moved without thinking. She crossed the loft floor in 4 strides and shook her older boy, Caleb, awake. She pulled her younger boy, Wesley, out of the trundle bed and lifted him under one arm. The first match struck somewhere out at the barn. By the time she was halfway down the loft ladder, the barn was already orange behind the kitchen window. She did not stop for shoes. She got both boys to the well yard and put them behind the stone trough and told them, in a voice steadier than she felt, to stay there and not look. Then she ran back up the porch steps for the small lockbox under the kitchen floorboards. By the time she came back out, the front of the house was a wall of heat. The kitchen window blew out behind her, and a thin shower of broken glass caught her across the back of her neck. She did not feel it then. She felt it later. The 4 of them, Caleb and Wesley and Margaret and the lockbox, sat behind the stone water trough and watched the only house Margaret Holloway had ever shared with her late husband Samuel come down on itself. The barn was already a black skeleton. The corral was a line of orange teeth. The chickens were running blind in the yard, and one by one the cedars at the edge of the lane caught and went up like torches. The hoofbeats by then had gone. Whoever set the fire had not stayed to watch. By dawn, the wind had died, and the only sound in the smoking yard was the slow ticking of cooling iron and Wesley crying very quietly into the front of his mother's nightdress. Margaret Holloway sat with her back against the trough and her 2 boys against her sides and looked across what was left, and what was left was the chimney stones and a piece of the kitchen floor and the iron of the plow. Everything else was gone. The first wagon to come up the lane that morning belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Aldrich, the nearest neighbors, 3 miles over. They came because they had seen the glow against the sky in the night and waited until full light to ride out. They stood at the gate with their hats in their hands, and they said, in the careful voices of people who do not intend to stay long, that they were sorry, that it was a shame, and that the Lord giveth and taketh away. Mrs. Aldrich pressed a folded dollar into Margaret's hand and would not meet her eyes. Mr. Aldrich said something about how the country could be hard on a woman alone. They turned the wagon around within 10 minutes and rolled back down the lane. The second visitor was Dr. Pell from town, who had been called by a rider passing through. He looked at the cut on the back of Margaret's neck and put 2 stitches in it on the porch of what had been the porch. He said he would send word to Samuel's brother Eldon in San Antonio. He said it the way a man says a thing he has decided is the only practical answer. Margaret thanked him for the stitches and said nothing about Eldon. She knew what Eldon's offer would be. She had been a Holloway for 11 years now, and she knew exactly what kind of man Eldon Holloway was. He would offer to take the boys and make a place for her as a housekeeper in his back kitchen. He would frame it as a kindness. By noon the smoke was gone, but the yard still smelled like burning. Caleb had not spoken in 3 hours. He sat on the step of what had been the porch with his arms around his knees and watched the lane. Wesley sat beside her with his small thumb in his mouth, his other hand still clutching the carved wooden horse he had grabbed somehow in the rush. Margaret had not seen him grab it. She did not know how he had managed it. The horse had a small black scorch mark on one of its painted hooves. She walked the property in the heat of the afternoon. 2 of the cisterns had cracked from the heat. The well, mercifully, was clean. There was a small piece of the corral still standing on the north side, and the old smokehouse, set apart from the main yard by 20 yards of bare ground, had not caught at all. The smokehouse was a single room of mortared stone with a heavy oak door. It would, she thought slowly, do for shelter. For now. It was while she was standing at the smokehouse door with one hand on the iron latch that Caleb called to her from the porch step. He pointed down the lane. There was a dust trail coming up out of the heat haze. A single rider on a black horse leading a heavy wagon pulled by two bay mules. Margaret had never seen the horse, the wagon, or the man. The rider stopped his horse at the wooden gate that had survived the fire because there was nothing left around it to burn. He sat in the saddle for a long moment without dismounting. He looked at the smoking ruin behind her, and then at her, and then at the two boys sitting on the porch step, and his face did not change. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with black hair gone strongly silver at the temples falling to his jawline, and a close-trimmed salt and pepper beard. He wore a faded brown duster over a dark gray work shirt, and the back of his right hand, when he lifted it to touch the brim of his Stetson, showed a thick brand-burned scar that ran from his wrist to his knuckles. He swung down from the saddle without a word and tied the horse to the gatepost. He walked to the back of the wagon. He pulled back the canvas and began to unload. What came off that wagon in the slow, methodical hour that followed was a list Margaret would remember in her sleep for the rest of her life. A heavy duck canvas wall tent with poles and ropes, 2 folding camp cots, a cast-iron Dutch oven and a smaller iron skillet, a small kerosene lantern with a full reservoir, a sealed wooden crate containing a sack of flour, a sack of cornmeal, a tin of coffee beans, salt, dried beans, a side of smoked pork, a roll of clean bedding tied with twine, a bucket, an axe, a shovel, a coil of new rope. He did not ask her where to put any of it. He looked once at the smokehouse where she was standing and made his own decision and pitched the tent on the patch of bare earth where her kitchen had been the night before. He set the cots inside. He set the lantern on a stone. He carried the crate of food into the smokehouse and set it on the high shelf where she would not have to bend. When he was done, he turned to her and touched his hat again. He said only, "You hurt, ma'am?" Margaret heard her own voice say no. "The boys?" "No." He nodded once. He walked back toward the wagon. She found her voice then, and she said after him, "I can't pay you for any of this." He did not turn around. He climbed up onto the wagon seat and gathered the lines. He looked at her for a moment from the seat. He had deep hazel eyes that were almost amber in the late afternoon light. "Didn't ask," he said. He clicked his tongue at the mules. The wagon rolled out of the yard and back down the lane. Margaret stood with one hand on the doorpost of the smokehouse and watched the dust until the dust was gone, and she did not think to ask his name until the lane was empty, and by then it was already too late. She learned his name 3 days later from Caleb, who learned it from a boy in town. The man with the wagon was Cyrus McKinley. He owned the Diamond K, a small but solidly run cattle outfit 20 miles east, on the far side of the limestone ridges. He had owned it since before the war, the boy in town had said. He kept to himself. He had never married. He went into Crown Hollow once a month for supplies and spoke to no one if he could help it. He came back on the 5th day. The wagon was not empty. He brought lumber this time, rough-cut pine, a stack of cedar shingles, a keg of nails, and he stacked it neatly along the wall of the smokehouse in the same silence as before. He brought a small canvas sack of penny candies that he set on the porch step beside Wesley without comment. Wesley had been afraid of him the first time. Wesley took the candies that day and watched Cyrus the way a small animal watches a larger one that has not, so far, harmed it. Margaret made coffee on the lantern stove and brought him a tin cup of it. He drank it standing by the wagon, leaning one elbow on the wheel. He did not sit. He did not come into the tent. "Mr. McKinley," she said, "I'd like to know why." He looked at her over the rim of the cup. It was the first time, she realized, that he had really looked at her at all. "Your boys aren't going to be hungry tonight, ma'am," he said. "That's the only why I've got." He drank the rest of the coffee in 2 swallows, set the cup on the wheel, and climbed back onto the seat. The wagon rolled. The dust came up. The lane was empty again. Caleb, sitting on the porch step with the half-eaten penny candy in his fist, watched the dust and said almost to himself, "He's coming back, isn't he, Mama?" "Yes," Margaret said. "I think he is." He came back 4 more times that month. He brought a load of fresh-cut posts. He brought a second tent. He brought a small black iron stove that he set up on a stone slab beside the smokehouse so she could cook out of the rain. He brought a milk goat with a kid at her side, which Wesley named Biscuit before the goat had been on the property an hour. Each time he came, he stayed less than 2 hours. Each time he refused her thanks. Each time she asked, in some way or another, why a man 20 miles away was bringing wagons to a woman he had never spoken to before. Each time he gave her some version of the same answer, which was no answer at all. Margaret began, against her better sense, to look down the lane in the late afternoons. The telegram from San Antonio came on the first cool morning of September. The boy from the express office rode up the lane on a sorrel pony and handed it down without dismounting, the way the boys at the express office had been instructed to handle the Holloway place. Margaret read it standing in the yard. The telegram was from her late husband's brother, Eldon Holloway. It said that he had heard the news. It said that he had room in his house in San Antonio for 2 boys, and that he would take them in as kin. It said, in the last line, that he could find a place for her too, in the back kitchen, as housekeeper, if she chose to come. Margaret read the telegram twice. She read it a third time. She walked to the well and dropped the telegram into the bucket and watched it float on the dark water for a moment, and then sink. That afternoon, Cyrus McKinley arrived with a wagon load of pine planks and the first 3 frames for a real wall. He did not say anything about a house. He simply unloaded the planks and laid out the frames on the bare ground where the kitchen had been and looked at her, with one eyebrow slightly raised, until she nodded. They worked together for the rest of that afternoon, the 2 of them and Caleb. Caleb was 9 years old and had not driven a nail in his life, but he learned that day, and Cyrus, for the first time since Margaret had known him, said something that was not a strict necessity. He said, looking at Caleb's first crooked nail and not at the nail's owner, "Your daddy was a good carpenter, son. You'll get there." Caleb stopped with the hammer in midair. He looked up at Cyrus. "You knew my daddy?" Cyrus did not answer at once. He drove a nail of his own into a different plank. He said finally, "I knew him a long time ago, before you were born." That was all he said about it. They went on working until the light went. By the time they stopped, the 4 corner posts of a new house were standing in the limestone earth, and Caleb had driven, by his own count, 11 nails. Margaret built up the lantern stove and made cornbread and beans and coffee for 3. Cyrus, for the first time, sat on a stump at the edge of the kitchen square to eat. He did not stay long after he finished, but he stayed longer than before. That night, after the boys were asleep on their cots in the tent, Margaret sat outside in the cooled-off dark and looked at the 4 corner posts standing pale in the moonlight against the silver hills, and she said aloud to the empty yard that she was not going to San Antonio. She did not know if she was saying it to her dead husband or to herself, or to the man 20 miles east on the Diamond K. Probably all 3. She rode into Crown Hollow the next Friday for nails and lamp oil. Caleb came with her on the wagon seat, both boys in their cleanest shirts. They tied the borrowed mule at the rail in front of the general store and went inside. The store smelled of leather and salt pork and oilcloth. 3 men in trail dust were standing at the counter. The biggest of the 3 turned when she came through the door. He was a lean, tall man, 6 feet and change, with sandy blonde hair slicked back and a drooping mustache and pale ice-blue eyes. He wore a black leather vest over a white collarless shirt and twin holsters on a polished gun belt. His Confederate-style cavalry hat sat on the counter at his elbow. He smiled at Margaret the way a wolf smiles at a fawn. He said, "You'd be Mrs. Holloway." Margaret kept her hand on Caleb's shoulder. "I would." "Decker Vance," the man said. He did not offer his hand. "I run the Crooked V outfit north of your place. I was real sorry to hear about your fire." "Were you?" Margaret said. The smile did not move. He said he had a proposition for her. He said the burned-out section of her grazing land would, in his estimation, be worth about 10 cents on the dollar to any man trying to clear it and start fresh. He said he was willing to be that man. He named a number that would not have bought her a wagon. Margaret did not answer at first. Caleb, beside her, was staring at the saddle slung over the bench by the door. He pulled, very softly, at his mother's sleeve. She glanced down. Caleb whispered, low enough only she could hear, "Mama, the brand." She looked. Burned into the saddle skirt was a crooked V. The same crooked V was burned, smaller, into the leather of Decker Vance's gun belt, and below the crooked V, half rubbed out but still legible, was the older brand it had been laid over, a single H set in a circle. The Holloway brand. The brand her dead husband had registered in the territorial book the year Caleb was born. Margaret Holloway looked at Decker Vance, and she said very quietly, "I'll think on your offer, Mr. Vance." She walked out of the store. She did not buy the nails. She did not buy the lamp oil. She got the boys back into the wagon, turned the mule around, and drove east toward the limestone ridges, toward the Diamond K. The Diamond K came in sight an hour before sundown, a low limestone ranch house with a deep porch, a cedar shingle barn, a corral of well-fitted rails, and the long pale grass of the upland pasture beyond it. The slow, steady ring of a hammer on iron came out of the forge shed as Margaret pulled the wagon up. Cyrus McKinley stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag, sleeves pushed up, the brand-burned scar on the back of his right hand vivid in the late light. He looked at her and at the boys on the wagon seat, and his face did the same thing it had done the first afternoon in her yard, which was almost nothing at all. Margaret got down and told the boys to stay on the seat. She walked across the dust of the yard until she was 3 feet from him. "Mr. McKinley, I need to know why, and you're going to tell me today, in plain words." He looked at her a long moment. He said finally, "Come inside, ma'am." In the cool front room of the limestone house, he poured her a tin cup of well water and sat across from her, and he told her. He had ridden with the Texas 1st Cavalry during the war. Her husband Samuel had been in his troop. At a place in New Mexico Territory called Glorieta Pass, a Yankee bullet had taken his horse out from under him and left him pinned in open ground while a federal company came up the slope. A private named Samuel Holloway had ridden back, alone, against orders, and had got him to a field hospital under fire with a bullet in his own shoulder. Samuel had never spoken of it again, not in the rest of the war and not in the 22 years after, including, Cyrus understood, to his own wife. He looked at his hands on the table. "I've been waiting 22 years to pay that back, ma'am," he said. "I did not approach when Samuel was alive because Samuel never asked. I'm approaching now because I can't do anything else." Margaret sat with the tin cup in both hands and felt the slow heat behind her eyes that she did not let move any further. She told him then about Decker Vance. She told him about the brand on the saddle and the H in a circle showing through underneath. She told him she believed Vance and his crew had set the fire to drive her off her grass. Cyrus stood up. He set his cup down very carefully. He said, "Then in the morning, ma'am, we go to Marshal Beale." They rode into Crown Hollow at first light. Marshal Elijah Beale heard them out in his office with his hat pushed back, and by noon 4 lawmen and Cyrus McKinley were riding north to the Crooked V. They came back at sundown with Decker Vance and 2 of his hands in irons and 4 head of Holloway-branded cattle in the rope corral behind the marshal's office. Cyrus stood at Margaret's shoulder while she gave her testimony. He did not speak in front of the others. He did not need to. The fact of him standing there 2 paces behind her was an entire argument by itself. There is a kind of debt, and there has always been this kind of debt, that does not get paid in money. It does not get paid in words. It gets paid the way a man 20 miles east of a burned-out homestead pays it, by harnessing his mules to a wagon and loading it in silence and turning it down a dust road toward a woman he has never met, because the man whose life she shared once saved his, a long time ago, in a country he no longer talks about. The world is full of widows sitting in the gray dawn behind a stone water trough with their children pressed against their sides, counting what is left, and finding that what is left fits inside the front pocket of an apron. Most folks who pass by such a yard the next morning will tip their hat and press a folded dollar into a hand that will not meet their eyes, and they will turn the wagon around and roll back down the lane. What the world rarely expects, but what the world sometimes gets, is the other kind of visitor, the kind who does not press a dollar into a hand, the kind who does not say he is sorry, the kind who unloads a tent and a stove and a goat and a stack of pine planks in a yard where the chimney stones are still warm, and rides away without offering his name, and comes back the next week because somewhere long ago a man whose face he can still see saved his life and never asked anything in return. That is how some debts get carried. Not in announcements, in wagons, in silence, in the stubborn act of showing up, again and again, without explanation. Margaret Holloway rebuilt the place on the limestone slope outside Crown Hollow. The new house was smaller than the old one and stronger. Caleb learned to drive a nail. Wesley learned to milk a goat. The grass came back in the spring. The brand on the cattle was the H in the circle, the one Samuel had registered the year his oldest son was born. And on Sundays, sometimes a tall man on a black horse came up out of the heat haze leading a wagon, and sometimes he stayed for supper, and sometimes he didn't. If a woman is ever told that the country is too hard for her, that she should pack the boys and move into the back kitchen of a man she does not respect, let her remember Margaret Holloway. Let her remember that the dust trail coming up out of the heat haze on the day after the worst day of her life may be carrying something the country owes her. The wagons come. The debts come due. The country always was, in the end, watching.